Hello, I'm Darren Walker. I am a brown-skinned African American man with a bald head wearing lucite frame glasses. I have a navy blazer and a blue check shirt. I'm sitting in my office at the Ford Foundation. Welcome, welcome to Ideas at Ford, a conversation today with two distinguished economists whose book, Good Economics for Hard Times, is something I commend to you. I commend it not only because it is written in practical, readable prose, which isn't always the case when you read the work of economists, but these two economists are unique. I want to welcome Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, who are professors at MIT, whose work has brought forth the challenge of inequality, immigration, trade, in practical terms that we can understand. So please join me in welcoming. Please join Esther and Abhijit. Hopefully you'll come up. There you are.
Hello.
So please, Esther.
Hi, my name is Esther Duflo. I'm a short white woman with brown hair wearing an orange shirt and sitting in my office here at MIT.
Hi, I'm Abhijit Banerjee. I'm a brown-skinned man who's losing his hair fast, wearing a blue-green shirt, bush shirt, and a white vest. And I'm at home because my son his school is closed because some other children have COVID.
Well, you both are with us to talk about your book. And as Abhijit knows, I take great pride in today's conversation, in part because he is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Economics at MIT. And we were laughing earlier because we have this Google alert here whenever the Ford Foundation appears, and our lines were on fire last year on the occasion of the awarding of the Nobel Prize in economics. And so congratulations, Abhijit. I'm sure that in many ways you were distinguished and you and Esther were well known, but now you're really well known.
Thank you.
So let's talk about economics. Can I just say, economics and economists are really challenging people and as a discipline. Why? And I know we're going to talk about the book, and I know you're not here to explain and help us understand every dimension and the complexity of economics as a discipline and the particular types of people who choose to become economists. But you talk about in your book why this discipline is a challenge for a lot of people, and why so much of what is written and understood is in the context of economists talking to economists and research papers being shared amongst networks, but it never really translating. Obviously, we've got the icons like Keynes and Friedman, et cetera. But for the most part, there's not a lot of warm embrace of economics from the public.
That's to put it mildly. We in the book, we cite a couple of polls in which pretty much, with the exception of politicians, economists are rock bottom in the list of people who are trusted to speak accurately about their own profession. And doctors get 80-ish% support, and economists 25-ish. So that's really quite catastrophic, I would say.
Esther, why do you think that is the case?
Well, weather forecasters get 50%.
Weather forecasters get 50%?
Weather forecasters get 50%. And so I think that comparison is actually interesting, especially if you think that this poll was taken in the UK, where they tell you that if you don't like the weather, you can just wait a little bit and it's going to change. So you would think that in the UK, at least weather forecasters could compete with economists, but that's not the case. And I think that's related to the fact that weather forecasters, as bad as they are in any way, in some sense, better than economists at what most people think that economists should be doing. So I think a lot of people think of economists as people wearing suits and ties, going on television to talk about the future economic growth and discuss what's going to happen to the stock market and to the interest rate and to GDP growth. And it turns out that we are extremely bad at doing that. First, there are some economists who do forecasting. For example, at the IMF, there is a big forecasting department. And we are terrible at doing it. The Economist once compared the performance of the IMF forecasting department to throwing a dice for a random number, or to just using always 3%. And it's about as accurate at doing that. But of course, they are trying to do a little bit better, but they are failing at doing that. And the reason is that it's really, really difficult to know what's going to happen to the economy. So, but that's one reason why economists are not trusted, is because most people think they're forecasters and we are bad at forecasting. And the other has more to do with Friedman, as you mentioned, and with the ideological position of a lot of the economic discourse. And maybe Abhijit can say more about that part.
Well, I mean, Milton Friedman was more famous in a different generation than he is now, but he was the icon of right-wing economics. People like Ronald Reagan swore by him. And he sort of started from the position that anything the state does it wrong. The market should always do everything. And that idea is, I would say, by now, essentially extinct in economics. I mean, you will find some people in the lunatic fringe of economics who really insist on that, but most people have resigned themselves, for better or for worse, to the idea that the state plays a very important role in regulating and making good economics happen.
But Abhijit, but Friedman, Abhijit, still has many accolades. I mean, at the University of Chicago and other places.
Even at University of Chicago, for example, Michael Kremer, who won the Nobel Prize with us and is by no means close to Friedman in any of his positions that I can remember, is also a professor at the University of Chicago. Even the University of Chicago has started hiring lots of people who have very different points of view than Milton Friedman. I just think the common sense of the profession has shifted substantially away from that. But to take your point, I think the people on TV who take Friedman's name are not necessarily always the most professionally recognized economists. They're ideologues of different kinds or agents of financial institutions. Huge number of people on TV who are purportedly economists are actually just paid agents of financial institutions who have very clear stake in particular government policies, and of course, and often in very hands-off policies. Low inflation, low interest rate. Let's not worry about anything else. That kind of policy. So it's not accidental. I think the suspicion of economists comes from the association of economists with a particular position, sort of partly Panglossian, partly just intolerant of all distributional claims and worries about inequality. And those people show up on TV a lot. They're not
right. I mean, I think it's not. I think that's exactly right. We're not without a lot of representation of economics and economic thinking and economic philosophy, and most notably, Friedman has dominated my generation. But the work that you do has actually, and the work that is in this book, which I want to get to, really addresses some of the fundamental challenges we face as a planet. Let's talk about immigration, trade. Let's start with immigration. You have done really tremendous work on this issue, and one of the elephants in the room around immigration, if we just take the United States as an example, is the question of what effect does immigration have on the wages, for example, of low-wage American workers. That argument is one of the elephants in the room when you have social progressive organizations working on civil rights for African Americans and others, and those advancing immigration, and this real tension that. Why don't you share from your perspective your findings thus far?
Well, one of the Nobel Prize this year went to three wonderful economists, David Card, Josh Angrist, and Guido Imbens, who, a bit like us, are much more into establishing facts than about trying to defend a particular ideological view of the world. And David Card, in particular, wrote a famous, a classic paper that really turned this conventional wisdom elephant in the room on its head, if that makes sense. If you can imagine the elephant with its head on the floor, which is whether or not, in fact, immigration hurts the native workers with low wages. And what he did is that he looked at an episode with massive immigration, which is the Mariel boat lift episode in Miami, when Fidel Castro suddenly told people, if you want to leave Cuba, go right ahead and leave Cuba. And for a few days, hundreds of thousands of Cubans left and landed in Miami. And what Card did is that he compared the wages and employment of low wage workers in Miami, and then subsequent workers looked at it by race as well and by level of work, and compared it to very similar cities that were on similar trends but did not experience the Mariel boat lift. And what he found is nothing. Is the dog did not bark. There is no impact of this massive migrant impact on the wages and employment of the native low-income workers. And that was a startling result because it was so unexpected, I think, for everyone, maybe even for him. But what is striking is that it was then replicated in any number of settings, looking at other episodes of large influx of migrants, or sometimes smaller influx of migrants. And that this is a result that for low-income migrant holds very, very firmly. And conversely, when there was episodes to kick out migrants, for example, out of California, the Kennedy administration basically rescinded all the visa that the seasonal fruit pickers had. And that also had no impact on wages or employment of the native low-income workers. So,
but Esther, why do we then continue? And obviously, why do we continue then to have these narratives be a part of our political discourse if what you are saying is that there is rigorous evidence that supports these facts? Why are facts that are counter to what this evidence demonstrates, why is that dominating public policy? Now, I know you're not political scientists, so I don't expect you to, but it is interesting.
Yeah, so I think part of it, of course, is that some people have no stake in getting the facts right. President Trump being a prominent example of that school of thought. So there's there are clearly people who are happy to abuse facts for their convenience. But I think it's also the case that I think the idea that there should be the idea of supply and demand, and somehow that giving you a clear answer is both somehow implanted in everybody who took high school economics, or even didn't take high school economics, and everybody finds it intuitive. And the reason why it's wrong is important. That's sort of why we wrote the book. Is exactly that kind of. Is understanding the reason why it's wrong is important. The reason why it's wrong is not because somehow supply demand is wrong, but because it wasn't being applied right. So you think about what happens when a lot of people come. Yes, they work, and so there's more supply of workers, but they also eat. They also live in houses. They get haircuts. Their children go to daycare. All of those things happen, and those things create demand for employees as well. So one of the reasons, there are multiple reasons why it doesn't work, but one reason it doesn't work, the supply-demand argument that people find intuitive doesn't work, is that people actually ignore the fact that there is this other massive demand effect. Lots of things. When 500,000 people show up, lots of things change, and those when some of those are good for workers, others are bad for workers. On net, there is not really much of an effect. It's not that if you kept the demand fixed, then wages would probably go down, but the demand doesn't stay fixed. That's an example of what we try to do in the book, which is to elaborate on the logic behind what is found.
Right. Another thing you do in the book, again, I don't want to paint you as a sociologist or an anthropologist, but you really nail the kind of Puritan ethic in American culture. It's really well described in the discussion about interventions to reduce poverty, programs like AFDC and TANF, and the experiments with conditional cash transfers, for example. And so I'd love for you and what's fantastic about this is, neither of you are native born to America. You are Americans, but you get this fundamental underpinning of the kind of Puritan ethic that we take such great pride in here, and how that has actually informed our policy around public supports for poverty reduction.
It's another place where our intuitions are so powerful that sometimes they stand in the fact of they stand in the way of taking the facts into account and into consideration. Another elephant on the room, if there is any place left with the immigration one, is the idea that if the social transfer program are too generous, people will be robbed of the American dream one day. They will stop going to work, and they will not progress in life, and they will end up not only weighing on society, but it won't even be good for them or for their children.
Esther, that it actually produces sort of lazy, slovenly behavior and the kind of dysfunction that is bad for society. And this idea, Andrew Carnegie talked about this. When you give away, don't give to those who are deserving. He talked about that in his great gospel of wealth, his message to wealthy people, which is why even today, when you hear people say things like, "Well, I only want to help those who want to help themselves," isn't that interesting?
And it's interesting, and it's destructive, because it has really cast this like a very long shadow on the whole design of social insurance program, which are not thought of as insurance program as they should really be, but which are thought of as a form of charity, and therefore to be governed by this principle of Carnegie principle of paternalism, which means that you have to be careful not to be too nice, lest people stopped working. And the facts are that there is very little evidence for that. So you cited evidence from the conditional cash transfers, which have taken place all over the world, and show that when you give poor people, fairly large amount of money, not in exchange of working, sometimes in exchange of sending their kids to school or getting immunization and the like, they don't work less. There are other experiences, for example, on Native American reservations, where everyone gets the fixed income and people don't work less. On the contrary, it really helps, propel their family on much better trajectory. And most recently, with the CARES Act, where people had received $600 weekly payments when they were unemployed, which is often more than what they could get if they worked. And even that had no impact on people's labor supply. That's been shown by half a dozen studies. But again, and maybe Abhijit can pick up from there, there's our ideological blinds prevents us from seeing those results sometimes.
Abhijit, don't you think that the ideology, I mean, we at Ford have supported many of those conditional cash transfer programs from CCT, from Oportunidades in Mexico, and then Bolsa Familia in Brazil. All of these work. They demonstrate the efficacy of the hypothesis. And yet, when you bring this to policymakers, they categorically reject it.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, to give another example, which was very explicitly and quite very importantly supported by Ford, is this program called the Ultra Poor Program, which is a program designed by BRAC. And there were 7 randomized controlled trials of that program done simultaneously, sponsored by Ford Foundation, and its results were dramatic to the point where now I think 43 countries have adopted some version of that program. So because they were done all together, they all demonstrated that very poor people, when given a leg up, and these are people who would be seen in the Carnegie doctrine as being the undeserving poor, because they were typically people who were doing nothing. They were often women who were living off begging or things like that. So not particularly, active, striving poor. And when you give them an asset and some training and some emotional help for temporarily, we look at them 10 years later. 10 years later, they're 25% richer than the people who didn't get it. This is a randomized controlled trial. And I think that kind of evidence has been extraordinarily influential when it's been available. The problem, I think, partly is that the evidence is still, I would say the evidence is still not quite as well understood, and maybe when you show the evidence, people say, "Well, that happened in India and that happened." I mean, I think there has not been a single large UBI trial in the U.S. Ever. Have these 100 people trials and here and there, but really none. And I think that's
absolutely. But don't you think that part of that is because of this idea of work? That this notion that people would get cash, even though most people who would be getting the cash would have some form of work. But yet and still, you really cannot find any, you don't find a movement, broadly speaking, to really experiment with this.
In fact, I think that's right. In fact, to go take Esther's point from before, I think the reason we get it wrong is we forget the fact that how humiliating and kind of just discombobulating it is to be A, being not having a job, and B, being treated as the guilty party. I think that's the psychological burden of that actually puts people back. If people were, one of the things we find in fact, our work on the ultra poor programs, this one is in Ghana, is that when you give people money, they actually are more productive because it takes a weight off their mind. They're not feeling so bad about themselves. They actually start working harder rather than less hard. Or more importantly, per hour work, they produce more. And that's quite striking in that it sort of, it provides the answer to why wouldn't this happen. It doesn't happen because people actually get depressed when they're humiliated and generally treated as being the agents of their own destruction rather than sort of the victims of some chance, mostly who they are. And that's something that really needs to change.
And in that sense, the last few months in the US, the political conversation shows that although it needs to change, it's not really changing.
What do you mean?
There was a quick moment, there was a brief moment after the presidential election, the inauguration, and the combination, I think, of the change in administration and the experience during the pandemic, where a lot of people found themselves at the receiving end of generous help that did not come with strings attached or with stigma attached, because everybody needed it. So I think nobody who got unemployment insurance during the pandemic felt like a loser. They just felt like the victim of the pandemic, which they were. And so there was a brief moment where you felt that there was perhaps the possibility of a consensus towards a reform of the social welfare, social insurance program that would put dignity at the center of the infrastructure instead of using the loss of dignity as a misguided stick in some sense. But now, in the discussion over this bill and over what should be left in this bill, you hear, including from voices from Democrats and in particular in polls, a complete this idea that there could be a more generous social insurance program has completely crashed, disappeared. There used to be more than half of Americans were in support of the government taking an expanded role in helping people. And now it's back to like 23% or something like that. And I'm not saying, politics should be done following polls at all, or that polls really reflect deep trend, but it's still pretty interesting that for a moment, I think there was a possibility of a consensus that we needed to think differently about how to help people. And that has gone, both in, the prominence of more, centrists, as they call themselves, Democrats, and in the discourse in the media as well as the polls.
And we're going to go to questions now, but I do want to underscore that, Esther, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, your analysis on this is spot on, because I believe in part what has contributed to that is the sort of narrative around the lack of workers, the desperate need of employers to have people return to work, the media stories of entire industries going without employees because labor is so short. And these shortages of labor are translating to inflation and all of the things that you know better than I as economists. And therefore, the notion of generous social insurance, when we've got millions of jobs waiting to be filled by people who just don't seem to want them, is, I think, contributing to what you speak of. Elizabeth, I believe you are going to be managing the questions.
I will be. Thank you, Darren. Thank you very much. The first question we have from the audience is related to the same line of conversation regarding economic incentives, which is that question of, do these types of monetary incentives contribute to inflation? And is there a way to avoid that?
They probably do contribute to, I think, till about a year or even 6 months ago, the consensus was that inflation is too low. And that's contributing to, at least among professional economists, as it was contributing to slow growth of employment. Now that we've had fast growth of employment for a very short period of time, we seem to have forgotten that. But basically, this idea of having zero inflation has, I think, it's one of the reasons why, for example, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, employment took so long to jump back, is that the inflation was extremely low, interest rates were extremely low, and that created a kind of an economy where things just didn't turn around fast enough. I think in some ways, my prediction is that we'll soon see a supply revival, which will be big, and wages will go up, and this will actually work out to be a good, but I think partly with some inflation. I don't think inflation is, I think the idea that inflation is always a bad thing is one of the great and successful plants of economics in the minds of people, and one of the more damaging ones.
Thank you so much. The next question is related to vaccines. You mentioned recently how richer countries' lack of providing critical aid and resources to poorer countries throughout the pandemic could come back to bite them and add to the increase in global poverty. How do we need to think about vaccine equity?
Well, it's one of these very frustrating questions where it seems so simple. I don't understand what is complicated. We should think about them as saying there is one world, it's a pandemic, it's a highly contagious disease, COVID-19, and it's one where when there is a lot of the people who get sick, there are more mutations, and the mutations eventually come back to haunt us. We are now in the throes of the Delta virus because the Delta virus emerged in India partly because there were so many cases. And where there so many cases is because they couldn't get their population immunized. And why couldn't they? Because there was a glut in the ingredient that they needed to make the vaccines. And why were this glut? Because of an interdiction to ship them from the US, which the Serum Institute, which is one of the world's greatest manufacturer of vaccines, or the world's greatest manufacturer of vaccine, had warned about. And several weeks before the massive rise in COVID cases in India, had positively begged the US to release this component so that they could manufacture vaccines for India and for the rest of the world. So we have an exact, and in fact, when this crisis happened in India, Abhijit and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called "India's problem is now the world's problem. The Delta virus is coming for you." And so it did. And so so this is just so obvious. In addition, from the fact that there is an obvious moral case, in addition from the fact that the political economy case, especially in a contest with China, is also obvious. And what is really baffling to me is why, given all of these things, we are not able, as a rich world, the US is not able to do it. There is any number of ways they could do it. They could force Moderna to produce more. They could just spend a lot of money to buy the Moderna vaccines or the Pfizer's vaccine at the price at which they're willing to sell us. They could, give much more money or doses to COVAX. Any number of things could be done. I'm not saying it's a super easy problem, but it's an easy problem, much easier than that we have had to face at the world, much easier than the climate change problem, which is our next collective problem. So it is something which is really mysterious to me for why it's not happening.
Esther, thank you so much. I'm so glad you mentioned climate change, because that is one of our questions, which is, do you think that looking at the growing climate crisis through the lens of economics can serve as a way to leverage more urgent moves toward combating that crisis?
And historically, I would say, alas, the economic lens was used often to put off doing things. The idea was somehow that as we get richer, we'll have more resources to devote to it. So let's get richer. And that I would say the economic lens has usually been a problem. Now, economists in more recent years have been working very hard to come up with, I think, useful things to say about it. There is a body of work which is useful, and in particular, I think the interest in how to find low cost solutions has been useful. And I think one of the things we learned, I think partly from the work of economists, but also just from the fact that technology has improved a lot, is that the cost of doing something is actually much lower than we thought it was. I think that's the main economic lesson that hasn't seemed to have entirely filtered into the conversation, including in the conversation in the Senate right now. But it is one where the economic costs are, I think, where in particular, the other point that economists have made, where I think, which is very useful, is that you have to combine anything you want to do about the environment with a much more extended social protection program, because there will be losers and winners. And the losers have done nothing particularly to deserve to lose. They have just were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And therefore, they then deserve to be protected against the consequences of what for us, the rest of us, is a good thing. If we can prevent climate change, that would be a good thing for most of us. Some people will be big losers, and those big losers deserve to be compensated. The reason why part of this, West Virginia politics is intruding on you in the US is that people actually don't believe that the government will be able to credibly deliver compensation to those people. I think that's part of the problem, is that there is and that goes back to this sort of this negative conversation about government transfers, which makes it hard for any politician to credibly commit to this idea that, well, yes, it will not be good for you if you don't use coal, but that's not going to be the end of the story. You will be compensated generously for it, because in the end, we want it to happen. That particular mode of conversation is kind of what one would have imagined happening, but I think it's one where I think the distrust of the government and the distrust of government transfers is a particularly big disadvantage.
I think we have time for one more, Elizabeth.
Yes, we can put one more quick one in if you don't mind. So this is the last question. You say that you wrote this book to hold on to hope, to tell yourselves what went wrong and why, but also as a reminder of all that has gone right. So if you could please briefly remind us as to what has gone right and sort of how we can continue in that vein moving forward.
Well, as development economists, we were, part of the economics profession that had most reasons to feel very hopeful, at least until the COVID-19 crisis, because the last 30 years have been really a bright spot, really quite hopeful. And in fact, this is looking at the poorest countries and the plight of the poorest people in the world. It's the one thing that could make you very positive in a world where in general there were a lot of problems. For example, infant mortality has been divided by 2, maternal mortality has been divided by 2, the deaths for HIV, which had been increasing till the early 2000s, started declining and declined quite rapidly. Malaria has been, controlled in a large part even before a vaccine for malaria came up just a few weeks ago through the rapid spread of bed nets. And more importantly, these gains came not just because India and China became richer, and so mechanically that's a result of people being less poor in those countries. If it was only that, it would be a bit sad, because now that they are, what would happen to the rest of the world now that these countries are out of the most extreme poverty for the most part. But these changes also happen even in countries where economic growth was not that fast, but where with their limited resources, governments were able to be pragmatic and effective, had the right focus on human lives. And so this, I think, is huge news and not necessarily the news we hear the most often. This also, frankly, gives me some hope for their ability to catch up after the worst of the COVID-19 crisis is gone, even though it makes you even sadder that the disruption of the COVID-19 crisis, including on things like immunization camps, malaria bed net distributions, and schools in particular, are allowed to persist for a long time. But they were able to make substantial progress during those decades, and I think that demonstrates focus and goodwill and ability in those countries. And I'm hoping that this focus, ability, and goodwill will soon be, back to express themselves and to go back for the benefits of their people.
Abhijit, good news from you?
I think that Esther got it right. I think I think the world is a much better place despite appearances. And if we can avoid the climate change catastrophe, I think I'm still optimistic.
Thank you, Professor Duflo, Professor Banerjee. This has been a rich conversation, and you have reminded us of why we do need economists. We need more economists like you, who produce facts and evidence and solutions. And so we hope that you will bless us with another book in the not too far future. Certainly this one, Good Economics for Hard Times, is one that we need today. So thank you so much. And we are so grateful that you were with us. So I hope you will join me in just 2 weeks, Anne-Marie Slaughter, her new book, Renewal, on November 9th, Gillian Tett with Anthrovision. And on December the 8th, we'll have Rob Reich and Mehran Sahami with their book, System Error. A busy, busy agenda for the rest of the year, but it's been a great year. Ideas at Ford. Good day. We'll see you on October 25th.